Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers to invite me today to this meeting, especially because this gives me some nostalgic feelings, as I was more often in this building before I left the Foreign Service in 2006, but I'm always glad to come back here. Now, as far as the subject of your conference is concerned, of course, Minister Steinmeier has just started a new initiative on cultural diplomacy about, well, good half a year ago in November 2008. We had a very interesting conference on cultural diplomacy, where for the first time, I think, the ministry sponsored an initiative that was based on the cultural department in this ministry. And that has never happened before, and I think it gave us some interesting perspective how to deal with the possibilities of diplomacy in the cultural field. Of course, the instruments for cultural diplomacy were already there. I mean, first of all, every diplomat knows, I think, that as far as cultural interchanges are concerned, if you have an opportunity to do cultural interchange, not only with foreign diplomats, but with foreign students, and that's what I'm doing right now as president of the Viadrina University in Frankfurt-Oder, you have a chance not only to fight against prejudice, but also to create better understanding and to make friends for life. Once somebody has learned a foreign language, once somebody has studied in a foreign country and has met friends there, I think he will have a much better understanding of the culture, of the language, of the history, and also of the particularities of the host countries, and you have won a friend for life. And that is, of course, also very important in diplomacy. However, today my subject is soft power in German foreign policy, so I will not dwell too long on the question of cultural exchanges. So perhaps we can touch that subject in our discussion later on. But I would like to explain a little bit how German diplomacy ticks, and not just today, but how it worked out from the beginning after the Second World War. You see, first of all, let me say the German identity is the identity of a mid-sized power. We are not a global power because we are not intending, and most probably also not able, to project military or political power globally. But as we are not a global power, we have global interests. We are the third largest economy in the world, and we are the largest, we are the #1 exporter in the world. And out of this, of course, comes the interest in having international stability, because without having open trade ways, open ways for international finance, with having peace and stability and development in other countries, we cannot secure our prosperity. And therefore, from the beginning of the Federal Republic, I think that the main purpose of our diplomacy and our foreign policy was soft power. Now, as long as the country was divided, of course, well, the Federal Republic was more or less a protectorate of the United States, and the foreign policy possibilities were very limited in the beginning. There were two important decisions to bind West Germany into NATO and the European Union. At that time, it was called the European Community. And that opened up a possibility of reintegrating the Federal Republic into the family of nations of Western Europe. Now, then, with Chancellor Brandt, there was a new foreign policy aspect of foreign policy, new Eastern policy, the policy of détente, that opened up a new opportunity or new opportunities for German foreign policy. But during all this time, I think German foreign policy was soft power foreign policy. And to give you just a few examples of the soft power policy was in the 70s, as a consequence of the new Ostpolitik, the creation of the CSCE, which in 1975 came together in Helsinki and adopted a charter of cooperation for Europe, and the 4 chapters of this cooperation later paved the way for more detente, for disarmament, and eventually for a peaceful reunification of Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, at the same time, there was a global aspect to our soft policy, and that was to create conditions in other countries outside Europe that would be conducive to stability, to more exchange of trade, and to peace and development in those countries who were our partners. Then, that was the aspect of East-West and regional soft policy in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s. Then, of course, we had also a particular part of soft policy as a part of diplomacy for stability, and that was the European Union itself. The European Union at the beginning had only 6 members, but it was so successful in securing peace between the member states and prosperity within the EU or EG zone that other countries wanted to join us. And in the meantime, after several enlargements, we are now 27. And most probably, if everything goes well with the Treaty of Lisbon, we might be 30 in the foreseeable future. Now, the extension of the European Union, or the extension policy of the European Union, of course, was a soft diplomacy or soft power diplomacy in order to provide stability and peace in Europe. Now, beyond that, of course, the Federal Republic has also used other means of multilateral diplomacy, and multilateral diplomacy, of course, in itself is soft power, because in multilateral diplomacy you are working with partners with whom you have to seek agreement on policy measures, and you cannot force the representative of an independent state to do what you like. So you have to apply soft diplomacy in the multilateral field. And we, I think, have tried this in many respects regionally and globally. For example, through the EU, if you look at the Barcelona process, where we tried to help the countries around the Mediterranean to find more prosperity, economic and social stability. You can see that as far as the strategic relationship with Russia is concerned, that the European Union is negotiating right now. You can see that in the creation of what is called the Eastern Cooperation, which means that the European Union, of which we are a major part, of course, is trying to create a situation at the new eastern border of the European Union, which is conducive to more openness and to more trade, to more exchange. And what we want to prevent is a building of new barriers and new frontiers between the Eastern European states and the enlarged European Union. Now, only a few weeks ago, the heads of states and heads of government of the European Union in Prague, Prague has the presidency of the EU right now, have decided to create this multilateral system of European cooperation between the EU on the one hand side and Belarus, Kiev, and then Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Georgia. Ukraine, Kiev is Ukraine, of course. So this, I think, is also an important means of trying to stabilize the all-European situation by working together more closely. And then you have other other examples of how we're trying, mainly through multilateral organizations such as the European Union, to bring about stability. And I would just like to mention the Middle East Quartet, consisting of Russia, the European Union, the United States, and the moral authority of the Secretary General. Or as far as the North-South relationship is concerned, the policy of the European Union, which is called the ACP countries policy, that means preferential treatment by the European Union of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, mainly former colonies of Britain and France. Now, all this has happened in, I would say, in two phases of German foreign policy. Until 1994, even beyond the reunification of the country and the fact that the country at that time had to take over larger international responsibility, there was a consensus in the whole political class, with no exception, that Germany could use in foreign policy only soft power, and that hard power, that is military power, could only apply it in defense of the country and only within NATO and within the NATO territory. And a consequence of that was, for example, that in the first Gulf War, 1991, when Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, and the international community, legitimized by a Security Council resolution and with a large coalition of the willing, intervened militarily, the Germans said, well, we are sorry, we are fully behind that decision of the Security Council, but because of our constitutional restraints, we cannot participate in military action. And so the contribution of Germany at that time was financial, to provide financial means, 13 billion marks at that time. And that, of course, was discussed in Germany at that time, because it happened just a short while after reunification. Would we be able to sustain such a policy of non-military participation, even if there was great unanimity in the international community on the action, if there was legitimation by the Security Council? Would we be able to sustain this kind of policy? And then by 1994, we had a decision by the Constitutional Court that just said, well, the use of German forces is constitutional and possible, well, in a legitimate action and within a multilateral framework. And that of course, changed the situation dramatically, because since then Germany has participated in a lot of hard power interventions, starting with the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, which was an extremely difficult decision to take. I was State Secretary then in the Foreign Office, and Mr. Fischer, as Foreign Minister, in what we call a red-green coalition, a coalition of Social Democrats and the Green Party, for the first time since the end of the Second World War, had to take a decision on the use of German forces, not only outside NATO, not only in an area where Germany had been during the Second World War and caused not a little damage there. And that was another conviction, that Germany should never send soldiers into battle in the areas where we had been in the Second World War. Now, and then, of course, there was no Security Council resolution, because the Russians had threatened to veto in the Security Council. So what to do? And the situation on the ground was that more than 1,000 people had been murdered, more than 400,000 people had been driven from their homes in Kosovo. And the question for the Europeans was, can we tolerate such a situation, or do we have to intervene for political but also for humanitarian reasons? And there was a big discussion how to do that. And then in the end, as you all know, NATO decided to intervene without legitimation by the Security Council, and German forces intervened in the area in now this enormous discussion in Germany, and like the one that we had later on in 2001, when the question arose, do we participate in an intervention in Afghanistan? And as far as Kosovo is concerned, the majority of lawyers and the majority of the political class, I think, thought that, well, you cannot look the other way if in Europe, in the heart of Europe, in southeastern Europe, people are being massacred. And therefore, there was, I think, there was not, well, not a common understanding, but a large majority thought it was the right thing to do. And a lot of lives have been saved afterwards by another soft power intervention, especially by the European Union, in order to calm down things in Kosovo and to help rebuild that part of Europe. Now, later on in 2001, when the question arose, do we participate in an action in Afghanistan, that, well, was not as complicated as the Kosovo decision, but at that time, because at that time we had a Security Council resolution that legitimized Operation Enduring Freedom, but it was a country in Asia, and did we really need to participate in? And when the government decided to do it, Mr. Schröder had to go to Parliament because, you know, under the German Constitution, every action, every military action, or every use of German military forces needs approval by the Parliament. And when he went to Parliament, he had to put down a motion of confidence. And had he not won this motion of confidence, his government would have been finished. And he won it, I think, with 1 or 2 votes. So that was very critical and very risky. But Chancellor Schröder at that time took the decision and participated. Now, these are some examples that show the dilemma that German policy sometimes is in, because it is obvious that we are part of a greater world, and there are conflicts, and there are military conflicts, and what are the limits of our participation. And of course, we also realize you cannot solve every conflict with soft power. The most recent example was, you know, when we were non-permanent members in the Security Council from 2003 to 2005, we had a big discussion in the Security Council on the legitimacy of the Iraq War. And we were on the side of those who said this is a war that should not happen. And so thought 11 of the 15 members of the Security Council. So what we really tried was to use an international organization and an organ of an international organization, the Security Council, to apply soft power in order to prevent hard power. That totally failed, as you all know. The resolution of the United States that had been tabled was withdrawn, and the Security Council indirectly had said no to the war, but it happened nevertheless. So if you favor soft power, of course, soft power has its limits, and that, of course, gives you also sometimes frustrations. But on the other hand, I would like to make a few remarks on how soft power is something that is coming forward, that is increasing in importance. You see, if you look at international law as condensated in the Charter of the United Nations, then of course you will see that the international order that was created by the UN Charter was created before the background of a terrible catastrophe of humankind, the Second World War. And the main issue, of course, in San Francisco was how do we prevent such a disaster from returning? And therefore, the Charter basically intends to prevent wars between states. And the three principles on which this political intention is based is first, it's all in the Charter in the first two paragraphs. It's based on the sovereignty, equality of states, that is of member states of the UN, of non-interference in internal affairs, and the no use of force with two exceptions. One exception is in self-defense, Article 51 of the Charter, and the second exception is if the Security Council legitimizes the use of force under Chapter 7 of the Charter. Now, this system has worked well so far, but it has proven insufficient for a number of reasons. First of all, the notion of non-interference and national sovereignty has faded to a certain extent in the past decades. One of the reasons was the Declaration of Human Rights of 1947, I think. Secondly, the Global Conference on Human Rights in Vienna in 1993, where the final document signed by all member states, including China, the African states, all the states, including, or let us say, including all those states who have problems with the implementation of human rights. And there it was said in the final declaration, the observation of human rights is not an internal matter of states. It is a legitimate thing for the international community. And that, of course, made these two elements, national sovereignty and non-interference, and also the question of are we legitimized to do something to save people, let us say, in a genocide? That, I think, to a certain extent, opened up new ways. And another thing was that this shrinking of sovereignty and non-interference also made possible the development of new international law to cope with the challenges of those situations that are much more in the forefront of the international community now than wars. Of course, wars happen. We all know that. But if you look at the international community and what it is doing right now, it is failing states, humanitarian catastrophes, genocide, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terror. These are the problems that the United Nations, as the only global organization that we have, has been tackling. And it is not so much wars between states. Now, the Kosovo War, I think, was one issue where people started thinking, well, is humanitarian intervention really something that is legal under international law? So far, one can say clearly, no, it isn't, because international law becomes international law either by agreement or by practice, by long-standing practice by the majority of states. And humanitarian intervention has been discussed already in the League of Nations and later on in the United Nations. And a majority of member states, especially those who had gained their statehood by fighting their colonial masters, were relatively weak. They were afraid, of course, that humanitarian intervention could be used as a pretext of a stronger power to intervene for their own purposes in a weaker state. And so that was one problem. And another problem was that we found out in the United Nations that if you intervene under Chapter 7 with military forces to end a military conflict or violence, if you then go out of the crisis area, within 5 to 10 years, you have the same conflict again. And therefore, people thought in the big reform discussion in 2005, how can we manage with this situation? Normally, you won't leave soldiers in an area of crisis for 10 years or so. But what is necessary is to provide reconstruction, not just of civil structures, of the government, of the economy, of justice. You have to be able to improve the life of the people in that crisis area in order to have them accept a new order that might not lead to a repetition of the previous crisis. And one of the most striking examples for this was the intervention in Haiti in 2006. That was exactly 10 years after the UN had been in there, and we had the same conflict again. And so another, let us say, fruit that came out of the discussion on humanitarian intervention was that we need not only to take care of the time after the military conflict, but we also have to create an organization how to do it and rules how to do it. And that is how we decided to create in 2005 the Peacekeeping Commission that is now in place and is trying out its possibilities, I think, in 4 African states. And the juridical problem on the humanitarian intervention, of course, was also tackled in the reform debate, and people thought, how do we alleviate the anxieties in the smaller countries about humanitarian intervention, because that prevented the General Assembly to take a decision on this issue. And then we found a juridical construct that was acceptable to the large majority of member states, and that said, number one, every state and every government's first duty is to protect its own citizens, number one. And that means non-interference. Number two, if a government is either not willing or not able to protect its citizens, then it becomes not only a right, but also a duty of the international community to help. Sounds wonderful, but doesn't solve the problem, because the problem still remains, who is going to decide when to apply the responsibility to protect? So therefore, we have made some progress, but we are not yet there that we could say that we could cope with all sorts of difficulties, and including failing states and the consequences just by soft power. And and therefore, we think now, or everybody thinks now in New York, but also here in Berlin, that you most probably need a combination of both, of soft power with hard power as a last resort. I'll come to back that in a minute. Now, if you want to apply soft power, I think you have just to heed some basic rules. And because there are 2 possibilities of dealing with other states in the form of soft power. First of all, you can go to your colleague as a diplomat and say, look, my intention is to do this or that, and I think that's in your interest too. You can try to convince the others or the other to do the same thing that you want to do. That is one possibility, because in international diplomacy you cannot force anybody to believe the same thing that you believe is right. The only way is, to convince him or her, and that is one possibility. Now, if your partner tells you, well, first of all, I'm not convinced, but then we are not interested in the issue that is important to you, then the second possibility is to make a deal and tell the partner, look, I accept that you are not interested in this, but if you support me at this and this conference on this issue, I will support you on another issue that is important to you and where we could support you. So either convincing or making a deal are the basic instruments of applying successfully soft power. Now, for that, of course, you need international organizations. And as I said before, the only global organization that we have is the United Nations. Of course, there are other combinations of states that you can also use, such as, for example, informal as the G8, the G20, or the EU, regional organizations like the African Union, and so on. But if you are going to deal with global problems, such as human environment, global warming, international diseases, then I think you have to deal, well, if you have an international problem, a global problem like these, then you need also the global to successfully deal with it. Now, in international organizations, except in these informal organizations such as G8 or G20, you have rules of procedure, and you have to know how these institutions work in order to successfully apply soft power in multilateral circumstances. And well, that's another story that we could talk about for long, but let me just say that much. You are basically there is a possibility for three situations in which you can be. First of all, you know exactly in the conference you have a majority when it comes to the vote, because conferences take decisions by voting, and a majority of voters then decides. Now, if you have a majority, then of course the thing to do is to go to the vote immediately, because every minute you wait, every day you wait is not working for you, but for your adversaries who try to transform your majority into a minority. Now, the second point is that you are in a clear minority. And then, of course, you have to talk to as many people as possible in order to either avoid a decision, which you can do under the rules of procedures of any conference, just by voting with a simple majority not to take a decision. There are other possibilities, but then you should try to avoid a decision because it would be to your disadvantage. And the third possibility is that you don't know whether you have a majority and whether you can succeed in your soft power initiative. And there, of course, you have a lot of things on tricks that you have to know in order not to be surprised and lose your case. Just to give you a couple of examples. For example, when you know that your opponent has a majority, or you think he might have a majority, you can, of course, try to get a decision that the issue is so important that it needs a 2/3 majority to be decided. And that sounds theoretical, but it's extremely effective and has been effective for more than 20 years. The United States have kept China out of the United Nations by exactly that procedure. Every General Assembly, the Soviet Union proposed a resolution to exchange Taiwan by Beijing as member of as a government of China within the United Nations. And every time the United States said, this is an important question, we need a 2/3 majority for this. And then they won the vote on the 2/3 majority. That is, with a simple majority, they got a 2/3 majority on the substance, and that decided the substance matter. And another thing is, if you apply soft power, for example, you know exactly you have no chance of winning, then you can avoid a defeat by saying, Mr. President, this is such an important matter, we cannot decide this by a controversial vote, because, look, this issue has to be implemented and accepted by the rest of the world, so we can decide only by consensus. And many people believe that's a wonderful thing if you have consensus. But consensus in reality is something to prevent a decision, because consensus gives everybody a veto. You know? If there is one person in this room who disagrees, then we don't have consensus. And therefore, you have possibilities with soft power to really do and influence substantial decisions. There are other possibilities in the European Union, for example, where we still have very many important decisions to be taken by consensus, by unanimity. There you have to find a different strategy, and the strategy there is you isolate one country, even if it is a big country. Germany is the biggest country in the EU, but if we are isolated with our position, we will not sustain that for very long. You know, you just give in. And I tell you that in order to show you, first of all, with hard power, with military power, you normally cannot solve the underlying reasons of a conflict, number one. Secondly, you might use hard power in order to stop the fighting, because that's a prerequisite for any kind of negotiations that might follow. But you need soft diplomacy in order to tackle the underlying political issues. With diplomacy, you can reach a lot of measures to be successful. Now, last remark perhaps, you have to deal, or most of soft power is being dealt with, as I said already, in conferences and in the international organizations. And that's a complicated business, because you just don't have only the United Nations to deal with, and the United Nations means the different organs, the General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, the Security Council, the Secretary General and the Secretariat, but you also have to deal with about 150 specialized agencies, foundations and programs. And you need always, especially in soft power, that means, for example, peace building, you need lots of these agencies and programs in order to do peace building. The problem is that especially the specialized agencies are very difficult to coordinate, because specialized agencies have their own state assembly. And, well, you can imagine if the Secretary General tries to coordinate these agencies from New York, the director of the agency will not look to the General Assembly in New York, but to his own state assembly who pays him. And here again, you have to be able to apply soft diplomacy in order to get the necessary organizations together. And if you look at the major peacekeeping operations that we are in right now, you will see in Afghanistan, or in Iraq, or in Sudan, or in other areas of crisis in Africa, you need, or you will see not only that there are lots of people being killed, lots of economic goods are being destroyed. You have people who need food. So you need the World Food Agency. You have lots of refugees, so you need the High Commissioner for Refugees, you need the High Commissioner for Human Rights. All these organizations, you need the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program. All these organizations are independent from you as a member state, and you have to convince everybody that it is good to work together. And this has become even more important, because in the recent, well, let us say 5 to 10 years, the United Nations has developed into a triple crisis. A crisis of capacity. Imagine the United Nations is now in 20 peacekeeping operations involved in 4 continents. The United Nations has sent out more than 100,000 people, men, women, soldiers, policemen, and the United Nations is the second largest troop deployer after the United States. And once the United States are out of Iraq, I think they are the number 1. Now, the cost of peacekeeping operations is nearly 3 times as high as the general budget of the United Nations. And I remember when I was in New York, or came to New York in 2002, people said, once the cost of peacekeeping operations goes beyond 5 billion a year, people will not be able, or you will not be able to get people to participate. Now they are already by 7 to 8 billion, and it gets more and more difficult to implement these decisions of the Security Council, because if the Council decides a peacekeeping operation, then of course the Secretary General is supposed to implement it, and the Secretary General has not a single dollar, has not a single soldier. He has to go to the member states and say, look, I need so and so many people, I need equipment, I need money, I need policemen, I need soldiers, and it becomes more and more difficult to fill the peacekeeping missions that have been decided, and therefore it is important that all those states, in particular those who are not only in possession of the necessary means but also willing to put them at the disposal of the UN, do some diplomacy in order to enable the United Nations to implement what they have decided. Now, let me just conclude by putting forward a few theses for our discussion. First of all, I would say hard power used unilaterally is power projection, and it has the perception of being coercive. It has a perception, after a while at least, we can see that in Afghanistan already now too, that the use of hard power is perceived as occupation, and therefore, and it also has a sort of hegemonial character, because if you apply hard power unilaterally, one state does it, then of course the question of legitimacy arises immediately, because has it been legitimized by an international organization that has a right to do so? And I think one can safely say that hard power used unilaterally is, well, in all instances, I think, negative. Now, multilateral hard power sometimes might be necessary, and as we have seen in Kosovo, but also in Afghanistan, or to a certain extent also in other crisis areas, it is acceptable if it is considered to be legitimate, either by R2P or by a decision of the Security Council, and if the purpose is legitimate. For example, as we could see in Kosovo, as the purpose was to save people from being killed and to prevent driving people from their homes, that's a legitimate purpose. But you have to have both, I think, if you want this multilateral hard power accepted by the international community. And third thesis is, I think, that you sometimes need a combination of hard and soft power and smart power. And I think that is a preferred tool in multilateral policies and by associations of states like the European Union, NATO, and others. And this kind of combination, I think, sometimes can be effective even without legitimation by the Security Council. Now, the question is now whether we can overcome these three crises that I mentioned: capacity crisis, legitimate crisis, and reform crisis that we have in the UN now. How can we overcome it? I think the United Nations needs help. It needs help by individual states. It needs help by associations of states, like the EU, like NATO, the African Union, and others who want to be helpful. And I should not forget, we need help by the NGOs, by the non-governmental organizations, who are becoming more and more important in any crisis area of the world. I have worked with them very closely in New York, and I have the highest respect for the NGOs and what they are doing without protection in extremely difficult situations. And I have always admired these people and highly respected them for what they are doing, because most of the peacekeeping operations we know now would not be functioning without the help of NGOs. And I remember quite well when I was, we had when we were in the Security Council, and I had the presidency. That changes monthly. I took the Security Council to Afghanistan, and the most important information we got there was from NGOs, local NGOs and international NGOs. And I think part of soft power will also be a much closer cooperation between governments, international community, and NGOs. However, we have to see that the security and the ability to function of NGOs relies on a certain distance to military and to government. And to bridge this kind of contradiction in itself requires a certain amount of soft power. Now, let me conclude by saying you all know the book of Robert Kagan, of Paradise and Power, and he comes to the conclusion that the Americans are from Mars and the Europeans are from Venus. Now, Foreign Minister Fischer countered that with a marvelous phrase. He said, no, the Europeans are not from Venus, they are the survivors of Mars. And I think that supports the European approach of a combination of hard power and soft power, but with a focus on soft power. Thank you very much. So I'm ready to try to answer any question of on the subject matter that I have spoken to, or others, whatever you are interested in. Yes, please. Perhaps somebody of you could help me in organizing the debate, because I know only very few people in the audience.
If you could please introduce yourself also when you make the question.
Thank you very much. My name is Gunter Pleuger. I'm a PhD student at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science, Vilnius University, Lithuania. And what was interesting for me in your speech, in your presentation, I'm not sure that I have a question. I have a remark on which I would like you to elaborate, to maybe us all to discuss. Is that you noted that after humanitarian intervention or whatever use of hard power, the conflict actually arises after 10 years or so again. And then I remembered what Professor Nye pointed to us while he addressed us at the recording, that he said that soft power only works when the audience finds it legitimate. Then I came to the idea that it seemed to me that after the hard power was used during the conflict by some mediator, doesn't matter, United Nations, NATO, some state, it means that the boundaries of mediation have been crossed. It means that soft power doesn't help anymore to solve the conflict, and at least one of the parts of the conflict will find this usage of hard power illegitimate. And it seems to me then that the efforts to resolve the conflict after the usage of hard power by the means of soft power are useless, because they will never be found as legitimate by at least one part of the conflict. So I don't know whether it's a question, but what to do, because it seems to be a close circle.
Well, I understand what you mean, and of course it can happen that after the ending of a military conflict by hard power, soft power can fail, of course. Every political action, every soft power action can fail. But the question, and I don't think it fails because of lack of legitimacy. It is a question of acceptance by the people concerned. And if you look at the number of conflicts, for example, Afghanistan, in the beginning, the post-conflict strategy of the United Nations and of the main partners were quite successful. The problem, I think, arose in the years let us say, after 2005, when the security situation deteriorated again, and then, especially in the South, the powers who were there, the United States, Britain, Netherlands, had to fight more and more. Well, you could call it Taliban or Al-Qaeda, or I used to call it insurgents. And then you can get in a situation, and that actually has happened there, that the people compare the previous time with the present. And if the security under the Taliban was perhaps hard, but it was more security, less people were being... if there is no economic development, no social development, then of course people say, well, now we don't see anything getting better, why should we accept it? That is a problem. And by the way, I mentioned I was in Afghanistan in 2004 with the Security Council, and at that time in the north everything worked fine and there was practically no violence, and in the south it was different. And there Karzai told us, and also Secretary General, we cannot get a huge company like the Security Council with the 15 ambassadors and all the staff to Kandahar because it's too dangerous. And so I said, then at least let us ask some NGO representatives who work in the villages and in the towns in the south to tell us what's going on there. And these people have told us, well, 5 years ago, exactly what is happening now in the south and creeping up more and more into the south, and that is violence. And the reason, I think, is that, in the course of the years, there was too much focus on fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and too little focus on development. And the Americans in the beginning, in 2004, had a brilliant idea. They said, let's create these PRTs, Provincial Reconstruction Teams. And they said, we take 100 soldiers and they protect 20 NGO people who do development work. And then we will try to create development and security at the same time. The NGO said to us in Kabul, that doesn't work because we are not armed, and if we are seen to be protected by the military, we become targets, which we understood. And then the Germans proposed a different PRT, and we said, look, if that is so, why not create a PRT not of 100, but of 1,500 soldiers, and they are supposed not to protect people, but to protect a certain area. And within that area, then the development people could do their work. And the intention was that one after the other, you create these large PRTs until you have a network of PRTs all across the country that then would be interlinked, and that was the idea of getting the necessary security and stability to do effective development work and soft power. That never was implemented for a variety of reasons, and the consequences we have now. This violence is creeping up from the south, and the tragic thing is, if you look at the province of Helmand, you know, Helmand has only a small border with Pakistan and then goes into the center of Afghanistan. Now in the center there is the worst fighting right now. This is only possible for the insurgents if they have support from the population, because if the population would be on the side of the international force, then they could just tell them they are Taliban, and that would be the end of it. And how to get out of there, I think, is very difficult. I think it's a good idea of Obama to say we need perhaps more soldiers to create the necessary security, but what is more important is development, development, development. Another point, let me make another point with regard to Kosovo and the Western Balkans. You know, when we had the war going, we had a problem how to end it, because the Security Council was not functioning. The Russians had dropped out, and then we used the G8 to formulate this famous resolution 1244 that ended the war. And when the G8 had worked out the text, it was given to the permanent representatives in the Security Council, and then this resolution was adopted. That ended the military conflagration there. But at the same time, we thought exactly about what you said. How do we get real peace and security after that? And we also thought exactly about what you said. We need the acceptance of whatever we do by the local people. And that meant not just of the Kosovarians, but also of the member states, or of the states that came out of the dissolution of the old Yugoslavia. And it is not only the acceptance, but the question was, why should they accept it? Why should they? That means you have to give them an incentive. And we did this by negotiating, and that is the most difficult negotiation I have ever gone through, with 38 partners, the states of the Western Balkans, including the G8 and several organizations of the United Nations. We negotiated what was then called the Stability Pact for the Western Balkans. And the key stipulation in there was that we promised the people concerned to be integrated in the Euro-Atlantic institutions. That means NATO and EU. And that was an enormous incentive because, as you have seen, since 1990, EU and NATO are considered by many of the Western Balkans, Central European and Eastern European states, the kind of association they want to be in. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Ambassador of Nigeria in Germany here. I'm privileged to have met you again once, Ambassador, because I remember very much when we were in New York talking about the issue of the Security Council reform. I come from the capital. I know you very much, Mr. Ambassador, in the role you played with the G4 group and so on. So we are very much interested. I'm sorry to have arrived here lately, but I have two remarks, two questions. The issue raised, Mr. Ambassador, about this hard and unilateral action, which you said is really negative in most cases, which I also agree. But you see, at times, in dealing with terrorists, and especially non-state actors, states or groups feel that they need to use some kind of coercive kind of action. We have to address the question of people considered to be terrorists, and especially non-state actors. Sometimes you find that on the other side, these people are thinking that they are on the issue of self-determination. But when other states will consider them to be terrorists, this has been a lot of confusion and discussion, which I know that you have been dividing a lot of states in considering, especially even consider the issue in Palestine. You see that one side say they're calling them terrorists, the other one say they are issue of self-determination. So I think these are some of the reasons why sometimes coercive action people tend to use, but in most cases it tends to be negative, because even in my country recently we were trying to use coercive action in the Niger Delta area to coerce the people, but eventually my government said no, let's grant them amnesty. So sometimes you find that these things may work and may not work. So the other question, which remark we maybe have some thing to do with the issue, which I know you know very much about it, which is concerned to us as well. You know, the subject of the UN reforms, you know that we created the Peace Building Commission, or committee, we created the Human Rights Council, but then there were other issues which are very, very important for us. We don't know what Germany's feeling is now today, because I don't know what the most important aspect of it is all, which is very hard to you and very hard to us as well. Especially in Africa, we lost the golden opportunity in 2005 to create, at least to reform the UN Security Council, but nothing has happened. So I don't know, we are very quiet and nothing is happening. So we seem to have addressed the peripheral of the issues. Now we have not even addressed the main issue. So I don't know whether you have any remark or any information to give us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you have another 5 hours to discuss these issues, because, well, let let me put it this way. As I said before, you'd sometimes need coercive measures, and the Charter of the United Nations provides for that in Chapter 7. And so the Security Council can take measures, or the international community can take measures that are the right measures to be taken and that are effective. The problem is not the Charter or the international law, it is mainly the question of generating the political will. And the first hurdle that you have to take with any decision is the P5 with their veto. And a veto is cast normally, well, let me say, not out of responsibility for the international community, but rather out of considerations of national interest. And as the P5 have a veto against abolishing the veto, we have to live with that. But I think we have to make efforts to somehow civilize the use of the veto in a way that it is less used, and especially the threat of the veto is less used than it has been in the past. Now, second remark, terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. The question is whether you can deal with these challenges with military power or with coercive measures. It might be necessary, but it's a very, very difficult issue. First of all, I mean, how much is a state responsible if terrorists are emanating from its territory? You remember that most of the people of 9/11 were students from Hamburg, you know, foreign students who lived in Hamburg and had planned that in Germany. Of course, nobody knew about it, but is Germany therefore responsible for these attacks? How big has the group to be? Do they have to have camps in order to keep the government of a country responsible for the terrorist activities? Very difficult. And then, as I said, you see, the notion of terrorism is very, very difficult. You know that the UN has been discussing for years on end a convention against terrorism. But the notion of who is a terrorist and what is terrorism has not been defined, as the question of aggression has never been defined. Even the League of Nations in the 1920s discussed that without any results. And the problem is, of course, if you look at the last 50 years, now, you also come from a country who has gained its independence by fighting the colonial rule. Now, most of the people who have been doing this at some point in time have been called terrorists. You know, others have called them freedom fighters. And therefore, I think it is extremely difficult to use hard power on the problem of terrorism or on the problem of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I mean, if you another point that I would like to make. Look at what the development after 9/11 has caused. I think the fight against terrorism has caused more harm than the terrorist acts itself. It has nearly destroyed a society that I, as a young man, have always admired for its civil liberties, for its free press, for due process. And I mean, I would not like to be in the shoes of Mr. Obama right now to restore all that has been destroyed under the heading of fighting terrorism. So we have to keep that in mind. And well, another point is, for example, you just have to look around to see what you can do with hard power. Iran. I think the large majority of member states of the UN wants Iran to desist from acquiring an atomic weapon. Nobody knows whether they want it, but there is a possibility. And I think that you won't solve this problem with hard power. And the Security Council, of course, that has been invoked, which I think, well, it was not a tactically good move to invoke it, because the Security Council is a body that takes decisions. It's not a negotiating body. The Security Council takes decisions, and in an escalating way. You know, first there's a declaration of the president, then there's a resolution asking this or that. When then nothing has happened, there comes the next escalatory step until you come to hard power, and then you have two choices. Either you do nothing or you take coercive measures. But the question is whether this can happen. And in the case of Iran, I think the Security Council cannot solve all the underlying political problems. And here, I think the three European powers who are involved and are doing the negotiations with Iran are right to try the soft power approach. Because, and not only to try the soft power approach, but also involve the Russians and the United States in the negotiations. Because there are 5 basic problems you have to, or chapters you have to address in these negotiations. First of all, the Iranians, I think, have the right to make full use of their membership in the NPT, and that also includes enrichment of uranium. Not for a bomb, but in principle it does. Secondly, you need, of course, in exchange a credible and assurance that they are not going to build a bomb, and that should be supervised by the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. Third, I think if you want a solution, you have to withdraw the sanctions that have been imposed 30 years ago by the United States, and these sanctions are because of the power of the United States, like sanctions imposed by the Security Council. Because the United States tell you, if you don't heed these sanctions, the American market will be closed to you. Now, it's only the Americans who can lift the sanctions. The fourth thing is, I think the Iranians need, in the big deal, they need also a guarantee of security that the Europeans cannot provide just by themselves. You need the United States, you need also Russia, and fifth, you need, let us say, an incentive. And the incentive could be something like we have done in Europe in the hardest time of the East-West conflict, create an organization in the Middle East where everybody can find its place and where you can develop possibilities of cooperation that seemed not be possible before. And so if you look at this very complex problem, and you will see, first of all, you need negotiators who have the power to negotiate and who have the means to give and take. And secondly, you have somehow to make sure that in the end, people come, all negotiators come out and can go home and say, I gave something, but I got something in return, and only then you really get an agreement. And that you can't agree with hard power. So in the end, I think you will always need soft power to solve the underlying, sometimes very complex problems. Last point, reforms. Well, I mean, there was great hope in 2003 when Kofi Annan, by the way, I think the best Secretary General we ever had, started to put up this famous group of 16 people, eminent people, to make proposals for the reform of the United Nations. And the group came out with 101 proposals in 2004. And then we started discussing. And so far, if I see it correctly, 4 or 5 of these proposals have been implemented, and none of them works very well so far. Neither the Human Rights Council, nor the PBS, nor the question of responsibility to protect. And then, of course, the most important question, Security Council reform, has not been serious. Well, it has been seriously attacked since 1991. You remember the Indians proposed in 1991 a General Assembly resolution that proposed as a reform of the Security Council. And then this resolution asked all member states to comment on this proposal. And since then, we have been working in, in multilateral circles, bilaterally, and in what is called the open-ended working group, or as they say in New York, the never-ending working group, in order to come to terms with the problems involved. We had a chance, I think, in the end of the 90s, when we had a very, very powerful president of the General Assembly from Malaysia, and he in the end gave up, frustrated, because there was obviously such an enormous counterforce by the P5 that he said, I don't have a chance, and so he gave up. On the basis of the G4 proposal, and what is in the G4 proposal, I think, has been discussed for nearly 20 years now. Since that proposal was put on the table, no new ideas have been developed. At least I'm not aware of any. So everybody knows how that reform could and should be done, but there is a lack of political will. And I will not exclude anybody from this. I mean, neither the Europeans, nor the Africans, nor the Asians or the Latin Americans have been able to sit together and say, look, this is it now, let's go to the vote. And the problem is, I think, that, well, the Security Council, as we can see nowadays, is losing weight and losing importance. You see, the structure of the Security Council is still the same, basically the same as it was created in 1945. The main power is concentrated with the P5, but the P5 are not representing really the world of 2009. And there has been one reform in 1962. And in 1962, the council was enlarged from 11 to 15. 4 new non-permanent members were added. And at that time, you had the same discussion as we have had them over the past few years. They said, well, the P5 will never accept this kind of reform, because even then, at that time, they had the same argument they have now. Well, if the council gets too large, it's more difficult to get to a decision, which is true. If you have a larger group, decision-making gets more difficult. But what do you get in return? More efficiency and more legitimacy. And you have to weigh these two things against each other. In 62, let me see whether I get this together. France and the Soviet Union voted against in the General Assembly, which was practically the announcement of using the veto they have in the ratification process. Then Britain and the United States abstained, and only China voted yes. And 2 years later, everybody had accepted and ratified. And of course, we could have achieved that too. Now, what is going to be, well, or let me put it this way. You see, the Security Council needs more, a feeling of more responsibility for the international community. And that, of course, is also connected to its composition. Because had we got that reform that we had intended and enlarged the council to 25 members, and if the new permanent members that we proposed would have acted as they had proposed themselves by not using the veto, I think you would have had new practices of decision-making and of negotiating in the council that would have changed not just the rules of procedure, but also the political psychology. It would have given the decisions of the Security Council more legitimacy, because the 5 regions would have been better represented. All regions would have had at least 1 or 2 permanent representatives on the council, and you would have made sure that those countries who are the largest contributor, not only financially but also in other means, in supply of technicalities and so on, that these countries would have been on the council permanently, and that would have made more effective than it is now. And to give you an idea of what that means practically. You see, when the Security Council right now decides a peacekeeping operation and then asks the Secretary General to put the operation together, it takes anything between 6 and 9 months before the Secretary General can send this peacekeeping operation into the field. You can imagine what can happen in these 6 to 9 months to many, many people who are going to be killed, what it can do to the in destruction of a country, and there are lots of ideas how to cope with this, but you can't do it with this kind of council we have now.
Thank you. It's Ramona from Indonesia. Excellency, my question is this. You mentioned in your lectures that there are constitutional constraints in Germany if you would like to project hard power abroad. So my question is the German soft power foreign policy is a pragmatic approach because of the constitutional constraint, or is it a strategic approach of your foreign policy? So put it this way, if the constitutional constraint is relieved, then will you resort more to the hard power? That's the first question. And the second is more a comment. I think hard power and soft power is a matter of mindset. So in the UN, for instance, this morning we learned from Professor Nye that hard power is more the mindset of the state, because by the constitution, states are endowed by hard power, while soft power are more to the civil society. And United Nations is the organization for the state. So the mindset in the UN is the mindset of hard power. So if we are talking about reform, then how to make the balance between state and the civil society to have an equal access to the UN? If they have an equal access, and I believe that UN can produce equally both hard power and soft power. Thank you.
Well, it is true, of course, that, or let me put it this way, if I have understood you correctly, the UN is not, or the mindset of the UN is not hard power. The mindset of the UN, including the Security Council, by the way, is hard power would be the means of last resort. And that reflects the difficulty of put hard power together and put it into the field by the United Nations. Now, as far as the mindset of the P5 is concerned, that's different, of course, because all 5 of them consider themselves to be world powers who project military and political power globally. And when they agree on an issue using hard power, then it is for their national interest. And therefore, there is a different mindset. But the rest of the Security Council, I think, thinks differently. That is, by the way, one of the reasons why the G4, you know, Japan, Germany, Brazil, and India, and some African countries too, have said, well, we don't need the veto, because in the Security Council, you need 9 votes for a decision. That means the P5 cannot take a vote without having at least 4 of the others on their side. And 15 minus 7 is 8. So if you can convince 7 members of the Security Council not to vote, then you have a blocking minority. And I think if you have good diplomats, they should be able to either collect a majority of 9 votes or collect a blocking minority of 7. Then you don't need a veto. And that kind of result, I think, is also more acceptable and looks more legitimate than the casting or the threat of a veto. Because the veto is normally threatened because of national interest, not of responsibility for the international community. Now, the second point.
It's the constitutional constraint.
Pardon?
Constitutional constraint.
Yes, right. Well, we still have a constitutional restraint as far as military power is concerned, the use of military power is concerned, as insofar as it has to be legitimized or legitimate. Secondly, it has to be done in a multilateral setup. And I think that was a good stipulation by the court, because when you have a large when you have a large group of countries who get together to intervene, then the likelihood that this intervention has some legitimacy is much higher than if you have a unilateral use of force. And, well, as I said, you know, or as Fisher said, we are really the survivors of Mars. We had in the last century 2 terrible world wars. And the Europeans are not convinced that, that hard power, you might need it here and there, you might need coercive actions here and there, but that's not the policy that really saves the problem, the underlying problems, and provides, let us say, sustainable stability. And therefore, you need both. You need the possibility of hard power, but you should always use it, if necessary, only as a last resort. And this last point, of course, the question of using military forces, German military forces, is always a very controversial issue in the parliament, because the parliament has to say yes to the use. The government cannot send a single soldier, even as an advisor, to a peacekeeping mission without the consent of the parliament. And in parliament, of course, very often the opposition does not agree with the government. And very often the reasons for that opposition are valuable reasons that have to be taken into account. So that is one thing that that will always be there, you know. The argument, should we or should we not participate in military action? That's a political question, and that will be discussed in public, in parliament, and of course also within the government.
One more question, maybe? Or?
Yeah.
Or we could collect maybe the last 3 questions together, and then you give your final response.
Okay.
It's maybe 1, 2, and then 3. Okay.
Yes. As a former soldier, every time I hear hard power, I cringe. Because in the end, in the final analysis, people have to die, people have to kill other people. You mentioned in the last century we've had these terrible experiences with 2 world wars. We're coming into the 21st century and the new world war. We've had, whoever would estimate, there's been anywhere from 80 or 100,000 to 2 million Iraqis killed in these wars in the area of Afghanistan, Iran. There's a secret war going on in Iran now that the Americans admitted, and the Iraq conflict. It seems to me that this term, hard power, is just a euphemism. You know, and it's more comfortable to say hard power and exercise that, and exercising hard power, than to say, well, we're going out here to exterminate people or kill them or whatever, neutralize them or whatever. But as a former soldier, you know, I think that we have to really look at the consequences of that. I can't really think of a scenario where, for instance, the United States or Germany should have the right to exercise hard power given the past history, just in the last 50 years, period.
I think that's what I more or less said.
Well, you didn't talk, when you, of course you're not going to say, well, you said there are going to be certain instances where we might have to employ hard power. That's
Yes.
what you said.
Yes.
Yes, right. And I fundamentally agree with that for a number of reasons. That the Iraq war was based upon some lie about weapons of mass destruction. Millions of people, or hundreds of thousands, or tens of thousands of people have died. Soldiers, their opponents, and what have you. We have great, immense suffering because of that. All right.
Yes.
And so what I'm saying is I'm kind of like uncomfortable about the term hard power, and also uncomfortable about the consequences.
Well, I don't think I did disagree with that. I mean, we were against, exactly for that reason, we were against the war in Iraq. And we considered this war in Iraq as illegitimate because it had been rejected by the Security Council.
Just one comment. I would just say I was stationed here in Germany. I left Germany going to Vietnam. Without Germany's compliance and complicity in that, without allowing American soldiers to operate from Germany, there would have been no Vietnam War. It would have been impossible. They were part of that whole, we call it the triangle, United States, Germany, Vietnam. I was in all parts of that geometric figure. And so I disagree that Germany had nothing to do with the Vietnam War, and I certainly disagree that they did not have their hands in the actual prosecution of the war. It's common knowledge that Germans spotted for the Americans in Baghdad. I mean, all those things. I don't want to argue that. It's not the, that's not the subject of this particular gathering here. However, the German government allows for the Americans to operate here. It's like Germany is a big aircraft carrier for the United States. That would be my.
Well, that's another problem in how far Germany, as a member of NATO, allows American soldiers here in Europe and operating also in Germany. That's another problem. We could argue that for hours, but my basic point is, or my basic point was, that you really cannot resolve political problems with military power only. You might need sometimes, and as our African friend was talking, I would like to remind you what happened in Rwanda. And instead of sending hard power there, the United Nations withdrew the 270 or so peacekeepers at a moment where they should have sent a couple of thousand. So there are situations where you need hard power in order to prevent, for example, a genocide. And as I mentioned, Kosovo, there are instances where you have to act and where you even cannot wait on the legitimation by the Security Council. So these situations arise. Let's be realistic. I would be very happy if we could solve everything with soft power, but we have to live in a world that's slightly different. Now, but somebody else should have also a question, okay?
Okay, then maybe we could group the last two questions. I think there was one in the front and one in the back, and then maybe a final response.
Okay.
Please.
My name is Olga Bondardelli from the University.
Can you speak up a little bit because the acoustics of this room are bad?
My name is Olga Bondardelli from the University of Trento, Italy. Do you understand one? Not enough.
Yeah.
I have two questions connected to different interpretations of soft power. So the first one is a general interpretation, a long-term strategy as education, consensus building, opinion influencing of soft power. So in this general interpretation, I heard you are have responsibility even in university field. So I ask you about the mission of the university in this field of research, but even in preparing students to understand the global life, the political situation, and so on. The second question is more pragmatic, is connected to another interpretation of soft power. So in case of political crisis, in diplomacy, in dealing, and so on. So when there are problems, of course, first we try with soft power. For this second pragmatic question, the EU, first the European Community, now the European Union, we know it is an old story as an economic power, but no political union and no military power. So some people think the soft power in this second interpretation has a meaning when we have hard power beside. So all European countries have an army. I'm not militarist, but we know outside Europe, this soft power, this gentle power of Europe sometimes is seen as a stronger way of policy, but sometimes is seen as weakness. So I don't ask you for 1 or 9, but for more argumentation maybe. So what about the European army to support the soft power of the European Union? Thank you very much.
Okay.
If we can take the last question, please.
I'm Howard Ray, American, professor at the University of Rome in Italy. My question is more succinct. We talked about soft power. I appreciate, Mr. Ambassador, your presentation. I thought it was very clear. We talked about soft power, hard power, and smart power. In the context of cultural diplomacy, what is the future for cultural diplomacy? In the sense that soft power encompasses not just cultural diplomacy, it encompasses quite a lot of economic diplomacy, particularly the G8, the G20. All of these are soft powers. Some of the critics would say that it is for economic concerns, for interdependence, a global world, that soft power has become so important. But is there a future for cultural diplomacy as a part of that and as a separate part, or will it become obscure for just economic issues?
Yeah. Well, let me first talk about the long-term strategy in soft power and the mission of the university, and that gives me a wonderful opportunity to do some commercial for the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt Oder. So please send all your children there, and I think we will make them happy and prepare them for the future in Europe and elsewhere. Now, I think indeed that the universities, of course, are not making policy or doing or implementing policy, but they are a major part of cultural diplomacy, because what we are doing at the universities is an investment in the next 15 years or so until the students have made their way in their professional life and have occupied important jobs in the economy, in politics, in the cultural field, or in civil society. And the university that I have the pleasure to preside, the Viadrina, is some sort of unique university in Germany and perhaps in many respects also in all of Europe, because of this bridging function, political bridging function between Western and Eastern Europe. At this university, we have the largest part of foreign students of any German university. Normally, the universities have about between 8 and 12%. We have 1/3 of our student body comes from abroad. And from 72 countries, the largest group, of course, comes from Poland and from Eastern Europe, but then from another 72 countries. And, and what we are trying to achieve there is after 2 world wars, after terrible conflicts in Europe over the centuries between the countries around Germany. Germany is a country, by the way, that has more neighbors than any other European state. We have 9 neighbors, and all of them have suffered from us. And of course, there is resentment because we are the largest state, and very often this kind of lack of balance of power has led to conflicts in the past. Now, another reason that we had lots of conflicts was that we had different languages, different cultures, different histories, and let us say a different historic remembrance. And most of the European states considered each other as alien, as something that was threatening your own identity. You know, the foreign culture, the strange culture was threatening your identity. And I think the unique feature of the European Union is that the Union has changed this psychology. System and so on. We think that the variety of cultures, of history, of languages, of traditions within the European unity are not threatening our own national identity. On the contrary, we feel that these differences enrich our own culture. And this has never existed in Europe before, and I think here the universities have a very important task to instill this kind of psychology and of course with the necessary knowledge into the young people in order to have politicians and leaders in the economy and social business and the civil society who realize that the European Union is the best thing that has happened to Europe in the last 800 years. The second point is that we are, of course, also preparing people to understand their neighbors. So my university has one of the largest language centers of any German university. So you can come to the Viadrina. If you don't speak a word of German, we give you the first 4 semesters in English or French or whatever, and but then you have to learn German within these 4 semesters, and the last semesters then you have to get your teaching in German. We have foreign professors, French, Polish, Russian, Canadian, who are trying to put together something that is more or less our basic motive, to be international and to be interdisciplinary. And in implementing this kind of thing, we have, for example, something that is unique in Europe. We have a partnership with the Polish University Adam Mickiewicz in Poznan, and the 2 universities work together, and they have a joint venture on the other side of the Oder River. You know, Frankfurt is on the Oder River, that's the border to Poland, and you cross a bridge and then you are in Poland. And as Poland is now a member of the EU, you even don't know the difference. You know, you walk over there, and right on the other side we have the Collegium Polonicum, which is a joint venture of the 2 universities, one German, one Polish. And there we teach, for example, German-Polish law. And the people who finish this course will get a German diploma and a Polish diploma. We have a Master of International Business Administration, the same way. You know? And then we have partnerships with 200 universities worldwide of different intensity, of course. You know? But all in all, I think it is fascinating to see how this student body develops. And these people are different from my fellow students that I met when I was a young student at a huge university in Cologne, where you hardly knew your fellow students, where you had practically no access to the professors. And that's all different with the Viadrina. It's a relatively small university. We have only 5,500 students, and these 5,500 students have developed 43 student initiatives. And they do everything from literature to music to geography, and they have built in one of these old buildings their own a huge student home, all by themselves. The city gave them the building, the rest our students did. And then they are so far the only ones who run a bus line between Germany and Poland across the Oder River, because the 2 cities could not agree on how to do it, you know. So the students do it themselves. They bought an old bus. I'm telling you that to show, you know, this is a unique atmosphere, and the people who leave our university have a sense, an international feeling, and have a sense on how to understand not only the neighbors, but also other cultures, other ways of thinking, other histories. And that is the contribution, I think, a university can do for a better future of the European continent and its role in the world. Now, the European Union well, you are right, the European Union is not yet a political union, and it is certainly not a military power. But it is much more a political union than most people think, also here in Germany. You see, when the members of the European Union want to take a political initiative, what do? They don't go around and do lobby for their initiative. The first thing you do is to go to Brussels and try to make a EU initiative out of the German initiative. And only if that fails, then you might decide to do it bilaterally. So I think 90% of everything we are thinking and trying to do, we do with and through the European Union. And that is not because we are so good Europeans, but it's rational. Because, you see, when everybody in the European Union gives up a little bit of his own sovereignty, but in return, he gets back much more power. When I was political counselor in Washington, and I had to make a démarche with the State Department, and I came there and I said, well, we have a problem here, let's try to solve it. The Americans were always nice and friendly, and we discussed it, but more often than not, that was it. When I came with the representative of the European Union and said, look, we have a bilateral problem here, but that pertains also to stipulations of the European Union, then, of course, the action was immediate, because the European Union, of course, is the largest trading partner in the world, and that gives power. Or another point, the foreign minister of a small member state of the European Union would most probably, if he goes to Washington, received by, well, a head of some small department. But if the same foreign minister comes as the president of the European Union, then he will be received by the foreign minister and perhaps even by the president. So, and my third point is, in the United Nations, what do you think, how many decisions are taken in the United Nations where the European votes as a bloc? How many percent? What do you think? Pardon? 5? Some more? 20. Some more? When I left New York in 2006, it was 94%. 94%. So the European is much more already a political actor than people think. The European Union is part of the quartet for the Middle East. It's Russia, the United States, the EU, and the Secretary General. The EU, as such, is acting there. And then, you see, of course, the EU, within the different groups, within the EU, within the UN, or within the quartet, pursues different approaches to policy solutions or political solutions. And the fact that the EU is not a political power in a way like, well, a big power like, let us say, Russia or China or the United States, that has certain advantages. I had a Nigerian friend in New York, and he once put it to the point, I think. He said, look, when we Africans look to the European Union, we like you because you are rich, you can help us, but you are not dangerous. And that is exactly the point, you know. There are no zones of influence of the European Union, and nobody is suspected of trying to do that. So I think the European Union is already a global actor. The second point is we are not a military actor. Well, that's also not completely true, because, you see, the European Union is building up, as you know, these 6 or 7 battle groups, which are supposed to be used in peacekeeping operations. And once, so far, such a battle group, consisting mainly, I think, of French and German troops, has been in action in Goma. And when Goma was overrun by some bands of military insurgents, this battle group went there and saved and protected the population. And we hope that we have now, I think, only 1 or 2 battle groups that can be deployed. But once the European Union has 6 or 7 battle groups, it will be much better in a position to join in peacekeeping operations. Of course, our German problem will always be that these battle groups, even if they are internationally staffed, they need, if there are German soldiers in there, the approval of our parliament. That might be a little problem for the, let us say, for the effective and fast deployment, but, well, we have to live with that. Now, Now, cultural diplomacy and economic diplomacy. I think soft power or cultural diplomacy and economic diplomacy are parts of the same thing. You see, in the discussion on the reform of the United Nations and the international system that we had in the years 2004, 2005, 2006, there was one phrase, I think, that put this all together. And it was said, there won't be security without development, and there won't be development without security. And I think that makes a point. We will need security. If you don't have security, an investor will not spend money in your country. And the security can be provided, of course, the best way by having a good democratic governance, by having the necessary state structures such as administration, police, a working judicial system, and so on. But in some instances, you know, if that fails, you might need some hard power to end a civil war. But then, of course, in the end, to solve the underlying problems of the conflict, you need soft power, and that includes, in particular, economic development. And it is right that this has been underestimated, especially in national diplomatic setups, a very long time. And we need, and I agree, we need more people who understand the impact of economic development on international relations and also on the question of security in states who are still at a stage of development. Does that answer your question? Okay. Well, then let me just say that I thank you very much for your interest in this part of our conference, and I wish you a pleasant evening. I'm privileged that you invited me for the dinner, and I'm very glad to have an opportunity to continue the discussion with one or a few more of you during this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pleuger. Thank you.